In the sweltering summer of 1849, beneath the cracked timbers of a Georgia barn, something unspeakable occurred. Neighbors swore they heard screams that didn't sound human, neither from man nor woman. For decades, the earth refused to grow where that barn once stood, and no one dared to rebuild. Cold Creek Plantation lay deep in the red clay heart of Georgia, its white columns rising like teeth against the endless fields. Its mistress, Eleanor Brigham, was a widow known for her pride, cruelty, and a peculiar obsession with control, not only over her land, but over every soul upon it. She was the kind of woman who demanded obedience not through affection, but through fear so constant it became air. Her daughter, Martha, was her great disappointment, a girl of 23, burdened with a body her mother called a sin of indulgence. Martha barely left her room. Her size made her the target of whispers among field hands and dinner guests alike. But Eleanor saw something useful in that humiliation, a weapon she could wield in secret. By 1849, the plantation was failing. Cotton yields fell, debts climbed, and whispers of curses began to rise after 3 slaves had mysteriously vanished in 1 year. When a traveling preacher warned Eleanor that her pride had invited darkness upon her house, she laughed. But her laughter echoed strangely through the halls that night, and even her overseer said it didn't sound human. Eleanor's mind began to twist around a desperate idea, an offering, a cleansing, something that would restore her control over the land, the slaves, and perhaps even the eyes of God. That summer, she chose 3 of her strongest men from the quarters. She called them into her parlor one evening, their eyes downcast, their hands trembling. The Lady of Cold Creek gave them an order so strange, so revolting, that even the walls seemed to lean away in disgust, and the next morning she told her daughter Martha to meet them in the barn. Would you have stayed or run? Tell me in the comments. What do you think Eleanor was planning? The sun hung low and red that morning, drenching the fields in a blood-like hue. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and soil, and somewhere beyond the oaks, cicadas screamed like the land itself was warning them. Martha Brigham stood at the threshold of the barn, her heavy frame trembling beneath a faded muslin dress that no longer fit her right. Her cheeks were pale, her eyes rimmed with fear. She had not stepped this far from the main house in months. Behind her, the wooden steps creaked. 3 shadows approached. Josiah, Caleb, and Reuben, field hands chosen by the mistress herself. They were the strongest men on the plantation, hardened by labor. Yet what awaited them inside the barn chilled their blood more than any overseer's whip. Eleanor Brigham had summoned them at dawn, her voice even, her manner precise. "Do as I command," she had said, "and God will see you cleansed." Inside the barn, dust floated in the slanted light like spirits waiting to witness sin. A single candle burned on a barrel. The air smelled of hay and something faintly metallic. Martha clutched her handkerchief, embroidered with the initials, EBIs, and stared at the men as if they carried her sentence. None of them spoke for a long time. Reuben glanced toward the door, but it had already been bolted shut. Outside, the cicadas fell silent. Then came the sound. Eleanor's voice, faint but unmistakable, carried by the wind. "Do what must be done." Something in those words broke the air in 2. Martha let out a sound, half sob, half prayer. What followed was confusion, shouting, and the heavy crash of a lantern knocked to the floor. Flames didn't catch, but the smell of oil and sweat, mixed with fear, was enough to make the horses outside thrash in their stalls. When the door was finally forced open at sunset, the overseer stood frozen in the doorway. The candle had long melted away. Straw stuck to dark patches on the ground, and in the center lay Martha, eyes open but unseeing. The 3 men were gone. Eleanor did not cry. She ordered the barn cleared, its floor washed with lye until the boards turned white. The bodies, or what was left of them, were buried behind the cypress grove. But that night, the dogs howled and clawed toward the barn doors until dawn. And from the main house, Eleanor watched, her lips moving in silent prayer, or perhaps in satisfaction. Tell me in the comments, was this madness, vengeance, or a ritual only she understood. By morning, the plantation had changed. The air itself seemed heavier, carrying a silence that pressed against every wall. The slaves in the quarters whispered that something had gone wrong in the barn, something unholy. But no one dared ask questions aloud. To speak of it was to invite its curse. When the overseer, Mr. Harlan, returned to check the fields that dawn, he noticed 3 things missing: Josiah's hat, Reuben's boots, and Caleb himself. Their cabin stood open, their few belongings untouched. A wooden rosary hung from a nail beside one of their beds, the cross snapped clean in 2. No one saw the men leave. No one heard footsteps in the night. Eleanor Brigham stood on her balcony, overlooking the cotton rows, her hair perfectly arranged despite the chaos beneath. Her roof. She told the overseer to say nothing, to burn the clothes, to silence the gossip. But rumors spread faster than fire among the quarters. Some said the men had fled north, guided by the light of vengeance. Others whispered they had been taken, not by men, but by something older, drawn to the sin committed in that barn. That evening, the slaves refused to enter the fields. They spoke of shapes moving in the tree line, of voices that sounded like crying children echoing from the cypress grove. One woman, old Hester, claimed she saw the 3 missing men walking through the fog, their skin pale, their eyes hollow, their mouths sewn shut. Eleanor called them all liars. She gathered them by torchlight and declared that anyone who spoke of what happened would answer to her personally. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were wild, red from sleeplessness. Behind her, the barn loomed, freshly scrubbed, but still bleeding through the boards. That night, the plantation's dogs began to dig behind the grove. When Harlan went to drive them off, he found a piece of fabric clutched in the dirt, a corner of Martha's muslin dress. And beneath it, the ground was soft, freshly turned. He told Eleanor what he'd found. She didn't answer. She simply walked back inside, locked the door, and blew out every candle in the house. From that moment on, she was seen only by her servants, who swore she had begun talking to someone who wasn't there. Weeks later, a traveler passing through Cold Creek wrote in his diary, "The fields here are barren, though the soil is rich." The people whisper that the ground itself refuses to forgive. Would you have stayed and worked that land, or run before nightfall? Tell me your answer below. The summer sun turned cruel that year. Crops wilted before harvest. Livestock died without wounds, and the air seemed to hum with fever. The once prosperous Cold Creek plantation began to rot from within. Every morning, the slaves found dead crows lined along the fence posts, placed neatly, as if arranged by unseen hands. The overseer burned them, but by the next dawn, they were back again. Eleanor Brigham shut herself away, curtains drawn, mirrors covered. She claimed the light hurt her eyes now, that every reflection showed her things she could not bear to see. Her servant said she no longer slept. At night, her footsteps echoed through the halls, pacing endlessly, whispering the same name again and again, Martha. Meanwhile, strange noises came from the barn. Though it had been cleaned, lime-scrubbed, and boarded shut, sounds still crept out. Faint dragging, low murmurs, sometimes a woman's sob that faded before sunrise. Mr. Harlan, desperate to end the rumors, ordered the structure torn down. But when the men struck the first plank, a scream rang out, high and piercing, like metal splitting bone. The workers fled, leaving their tools in the dirt. None returned. The curse, it seemed, had found its roots. Crops blackened overnight, wells turned bitter, and the men who tried to leave the plantation met strange fates on the road. One was found wandering near the river, eyes gone white, muttering about the woman in the barn. Another vanished entirely, leaving only footprints that led in circles. By September, Cold Creek had become a ghost. The slaves prayed openly now, ignoring Eleanor's orders. Old Hester, the cook, said the devil himself had taken residence in the house, feeding off the mistress's pride. When Eleanor overheard, she struck Hester across the face, and for the first time the old woman did not cry. She only smiled and said, "You already gave him what he wanted." That night, Eleanor found the barn door open again. No wind could have done it. The lock had been snapped clean. Inside, she swore she saw footprints in the hay, heavy, dragging, like something walking on half-dead legs. At the far end, beneath a slant of moonlight, something glinted, a rosary, rusted with what looked like blood. Eleanor fell to her knees, trembling. "Martha," she whispered. "Child, what have you done?" But the voice that answered her wasn't Martha's. It came from above, from the rafters, low, guttural, and almost laughing. "If you lived in that town, would you have stayed another night? Tell me your answer in the comments. I'm listening." By the time October's winds swept through the pines, the Cold Creek mansion had become something hollow and trembling, a structure that no longer obeyed the laws of silence. The servants swore that when the fire died down at night, they could hear whispers, moving through the walls, faint at first, like a memory being spoken backward. It began near the dining room, where the long table still sat set for guests who would never come. The crystal glasses clinked softly on their own, as though disturbed by footsteps that no one could see. Some nights, Eleanor's voice would join, them, pleading, whispering, then rising into screams that made even the bravest men hide their faces. Eleanor herself grew unrecognizable. Her hair went white in streaks, her eyes sunken and wild. She began writing letters addressed to no one, rambling about forgiveness, sacrifice, and the three who would not rest. She ordered the fireplaces sealed, claiming the voices came through the chimneys. But even after they were bricked shut, the whispers only grew louder, now echoing from within the walls themselves. Old Hester was the first to confront her. "You called them," she said quietly. "You offered what was yours to something that never should have been named." Eleanor slapped her across the mouth, but Hester didn't flinch. "They ain't gone," the old woman said. "They're just inside now." That night, the mansion shuddered as if the earth itself shifted beneath it. Dishes shattered, paintings fell, and the locked parlor door flew open without a hand touching it. Inside, the portraits of Eleanor's ancestors hung crooked, their eyes seeming to follow her as she entered. The candle flames bent toward her, as if drawn by breath. From behind the walls came a scraping sound, deliberate, rhythmic, almost human. Eleanor pressed her ear against the plaster and for a moment heard Martha's voice, soft, begging. "Mama, open the door." She screamed for her servants to tear the wall open. They refused. Only Mr. Harlan obeyed, prying at the boards, until his hands bled. When one section finally gave way, a gust of cold air burst out, carrying a stench of decay. And within the gap, something small rolled free, a child's bone, smooth and pale. Harlan dropped it and ran. Eleanor fell to her knees, clutching the fragment to her chest. "She's still here," she whispered, "and she's not alone." That night, the entire house seemed to breathe. Doors pulsed in their frames, floors sighed, and every window reflected not one face, but four. Tell me in the comments, if you heard those voices calling from your walls, would you answer? Word of the Brigham estate's decline spread fast through Cold Creek. The townsfolk spoke in hushed tones about the cries that drifted down from the hills on windless nights. Sounds like weeping mixed with laughter coming from the direction of Eleanor's plantation. The church elders eventually decided something had to be done. They sent a man named Reverend Silas Greeley, a preacher known for his fearlessness and his obsession with rooting out evil. He arrived one gray morning in November, his horse sweating, its eyes rolling wild before the gate. The servants refused to open the door, so Eleanor herself greeted him. Her face was pale, her voice brittle as glass. "You shouldn't have come," she said. Greeley stepped inside. The air within the mansion was thick, damp, and strangely cold. Every corner smelled faintly of salt and iron, as if something buried deep was seeping upward. The preacher's boots left prints in the dust as he followed Eleanor through the long corridor, past portraits whose faces had begun to fade. When they reached the parlor, she poured him tea, though neither drank. Greeley opened his Bible, laying it on the table. "They say your house is haunted," he began, "that your soul is in peril." Eleanor smiled thinly. "My soul was bartered long ago, Reverend." "You cannot buy back what has already been spent." He asked to see the barn. She refused. "That place is no longer mine," she whispered. "It belongs to something else." That night, against her wishes, Greeley ventured out alone, lantern in hand. The wind had gone still. Even the crickets were silent. The barn stood black and hunched at the edge of the grove, its boards shifting as if the structure itself was breathing. He pushed the door open. It creaked like a groan from something sleeping. Inside, his lantern flickered. The floor was damp, though it hadn't rained in weeks. In the straw, he saw handprints, small and wide, pressed deep into the dirt. He began to pray aloud. The air thickened. His words came out as steam. Then from above came a slow dragging sound, the scrape of chains across wood. His lantern went out. He screamed once, sharply, and the sound was swallowed by the dark. At dawn, the servants found his Bible lying open in the field. Its pages were soaked through, as though it had rained only on that one spot. Eleanor burned it without speaking. That Sunday, the church bells in Cold Creek rang on their own, 3 times before sunrise. If you were the preacher, would you have stepped into that barn? Tell me in the comments. What do you think he saw? The morning after Reverend Greeley vanished, the air over Cold Creek Plantation turned gray as ash. The sun rose weak, its light sickly, unable to burn through the mist that clung to the fields. The barn, once silent, now seemed to breathe again. The boards flexed, the nails moaned, and the faint sound of footsteps moved across its empty loft, though no one had entered since the preacher disappeared. Eleanor Brigham stood at her bedroom window, staring toward that dark silhouette in the distance. Her hands trembled against the glass. "It wants me to come," she whispered. Servants overheard her muttering to herself, speaking to someone unseen, someone she called the child of the offering. That night, the dogs refused to go near the grove. They barked until their throats tore, yet still would not cross the fence. In the slave quarters, Josiah's younger brother claimed he saw a man walking between the trees, dragging something heavy behind him, humming a hymn no living soul knew. When asked how he could see in that pitch darkness, he said, "Because it glowed like fire without heat." Inside the mansion, the walls had begun to bleed, not red but black, a slow ooze that stained the baseboards, smelling faintly of sulfur. Old Hester said the house was purging itself, forcing out the sins buried beneath it. Eleanor laughed when she heard that, a thin, brittle laugh that made everyone turn away. "You think the house is cursed," she said, "but it's only answering." That night, she lit every candle in the parlor, placed mirrors against the walls, and sat alone before them. "If it is my sin," she said aloud, "then let it take me. Let it leave the land." The candles flickered, then steadied, and in the glass, she saw them. 3 faces behind her, pale and motionless, their eyes hollow, their mouths stitched with red thread. When she turned, there was nothing. But the smell of the barn filled the room, thick with rot and hay. By dawn, the barn's doors stood wide open again. Footprints, large and bare, led from it all the way to the mansion's steps, stopping just beneath Eleanor's window. The earth there steamed faintly, as though warmed from below. When the servants found her that morning, Eleanor sat at her vanity, eyes open, body cold. On the mirror before her, written in a child's shaky hand, were 4 words smeared in black ash: "We were not done." Would you have looked into those mirrors? Tell me below. What do you think the Lady of Cold Creek finally saw? The night Eleanor Brigham died, thunder rolled over Cold Creek without lightning, and the sky took on a color no one could name, something between purple and bruise. The plantation slept uneasy. Even the insects, constant companions of George's summer nights, fell silent. Then came the sound, a low rumble, rising from beneath the earth like a growl from something ancient. Old Hester was the first to hear it. She woke in her cabin, clutching her cross, listening as the ground itself began to shudder. The slaves rushed outside, lanterns swinging, voices trembling. From the direction of the cypress grove came a cracking noise, sharp, splitting, like wood breaking underwater. One by one, the graves behind the barn began to heave. The earth pulsed. Mounds lifted, then burst apart. Bones rolled free, long, yellow, some still wrapped in scraps of decayed cloth. A foul mist rose, stinking of copper and mildew. Hester screamed for the others to run, but they stood frozen, watching as something impossible happened before their eyes. The bones began to move. They didn't stand like men. They crawled, dragging through the dirt, pulling themselves toward the barn. The mist clung to them like flesh. In the flicker of lantern light, faces began to form, half-made, half-remembered, and among them, unmistakably, the shape of a woman's frame, heavy and bent, her head turning slowly toward the house. Martha. From her mouth came a groan that sounded like both a sob and a command. The barn doors swung wide on their own, slamming against the walls with a deafening crack. The wind that poured out was warm, rank, thick, and alive. The people of Cold Creek ran. Some swore they heard words in that wind. She promised. By dawn, the grove was flattened. The graves split open like wounds. The barn stood untouched. Too still, too patient. Inside, nothing remained but a single candle burning on the floor, its flame black as pitch. Eleanor's body was buried beside Martha's that morning, though no priest would bless the ground. Reverend Greeley's name was never mentioned again. And as the last handful of dirt hit Eleanor's coffin, the earth trembled once more, just once, softly, like a final heartbeat. That same night, a traveler passing through swore he saw light coming from the abandoned barn. Not fire, not lantern glow, but a steady pulsing warmth, like breath behind wooden ribs. Tell me in the comments, do you think the dead rose that night, or had they never left at all? Winter came early to Georgia in 1850, and with it, a silence so deep that even the wind seemed afraid to cross Cold Creek. The plantation stood abandoned now, fields gone to seed, shutters flapping. Against their hinges, the great house crouched beneath a blanket of frost. The few who remained in the nearby town said the snow never lay right there. It melted in strange patterns, as if the earth beneath was still breathing. For 3 months after Eleanor's burial, not a soul dared enter the property. But one man eventually did. Deputy Thorne, sent from Savannah to record what he called the matter of the Brigham estate. He rode in at noon, found the gates hanging open, and tethered his horse beside the well. The moment his boots touched the ground, the air turned colder. Inside the mansion, every surface was covered in dust, yet a single chair beside the hearth was clean, as if someone had just risen from it. The air smelled faintly of candle wax and something sweet, rot masked by perfume. On the table lay a plate of food that hadn't aged or molded, though it had been months since anyone had lived. There, Thorne made notes in his ledger, his breath fogging in the still air. Then came the sound, a slow, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails on wood. It came from upstairs. He followed it, lantern raised, his footsteps muffled by the carpeted hall. The sound led him to Martha's old room. The door stood slightly ajar. Inside, the air was heavy, stale. A faint trail of footprints led from the window to the vanity mirror. And on that mirror, in the dust, someone had written 2 words, "Still hungry." Thorne's hand shook. He turned, but the door had closed behind him. The tapping began again, this time behind the walls, then under the floorboards. He shouted for anyone who might hear, but the house answered only with the low groan of shifting timber. When he finally burst back into the hallway, his lantern went out, snuffed by a breath that wasn't his. Neighbors found his horse 2 days. Later at the gate, reins snapped, eyes wide, foam dried on its mouth. The deputy was never seen again. That winter, no birds nested near Cold Creek. The snow around the barn melted in a perfect circle, revealing dark soil and 3 sets of footprints leading nowhere. Tell me in the comments, if you were that deputy, would you have entered that house, or turned back the moment the air turned cold? When spring finally returned to Georgia, it came without warmth. The sun rose pale, and the new blossoms that pushed through the red clay near Cold Creek carried no scent. The plantation, though abandoned, still seemed to breathe. Windows fogged from within, as though someone unseen lingered inside. Travelers passing through the region spoke of hearing a single sound at dusk. The cry of a child drifting over the fields, thin as smoke. By April, curiosity drew people back. Farmers from nearby counties, tempted by stories of unclaimed land, came to see if the Brigham estate could be salvaged. They came in pairs, never alone. The first group lasted only an hour. They found the soil blackened and soft beneath their boots, as though something beneath was rotting. And when they reached the barn, one man swore he heard the faint creak of a rocking chair inside, though the place had been stripped bare. They left before sundown. None returned. Weeks later, a second group arrived, this time led by a surveyor named William Crowder. He dismissed the stories as Negro superstition and began work at sunrise. By noon, his men uncovered something buried near the well, a child's rattle made of bone, bound with red twine. Crowder tossed it aside. That was his first mistake. That night, they made camp in the parlor. The house was cold, even with a fire. As the men slept, Crowder woke to the sound of soft humming, a lullaby sung just beyond the edge of hearing. He rose, following it through the hallway to Martha's room. There, he saw a cradle rocking gently on its own, though no wind stirred. Inside it lay a bundle wrapped in burlap. When he pulled the cloth back, he found not an infant, but a lump of wet soil shaped like one, with a tiny mouth carved into it, open as if screaming. The air turned bitter cold. From behind him came a whisper. She had no breath, so we gave her ours. The cradle stopped. Crowder fled into the night, leaving everything behind. At dawn, his men found him near the gate, staring at the horizon, his hair turned white, his hands clutching that bone rattle. He never spoke again. By the time the county claimed the land later that year, the house had collapsed into itself. But on certain spring nights, locals still swore they heard it, the cry of a newborn carried on the wind, echoing from the ruins of Cold Creek. Would you have gone inside that barn if you heard a baby crying from within? Tell me below. What do you think was born that night? By summer of 1862, Cold Creek Plantation was gone from official records, as if it had never existed. The name Brigham was struck from ledgers, the boundaries swallowed by pine and thyme, but the field itself refused to die. Locals said no matter how deep the plows cut, something beneath the soil pushed back, a pulsing resistance that made oxen rear and men drop their reins. Children from nearby farms were warned never to wander near the creek. They didn't listen. One July afternoon, two boys chased a rabbit through the old fence line. They found themselves standing in the overgrown field where the air shimmered like heat but felt icy cold. In the distance, a woman appeared, tall, barefooted, with a burlap cloth over her head. The boys thought she was a scarecrow until she started walking toward them, her movements too smooth, her arms hanging long and loose. They ran until their lungs gave out. One never spoke again. The other kept repeating the same phrase through trembling lips. She wanted her baby. Hit that subscribe button and comment below what state you're watching from, because what happens next is buried deep in Southern legend. In 1871, a preacher named Elijah Pruitt bought the land, intending to build a chapel there. The locals warned him not to. Pruitt called them superstitious and broke ground himself. But on the first day of digging, the workers uncovered a patch of black soil that bled when struck with a spade. Not blood exactly, a dark oily liquid that steamed in the sun. The stench drove most of the men away. That night, Pruitt wrote in his journal, "The ground moves when I pray over it." He continued working by lamplight, determined to consecrate the field. The following morning, his camp was found deserted. Only his open Bible remained, its pages soaked through with that same black liquid. After that, no one tried again. The land grew wild, the trees twisting unnaturally, their roots clawing through the old foundations. People passing by at night said they could hear something moving beneath the soil, like the slow rhythm of breathing. And on fog-heavy mornings, when the mist crawled low and gray, an enormous shadow could be seen in the distance, stooped, swaying, and whispering a lullaby too low to understand. Some say it's Martha. Others say it's what she brought back, something born not of flesh, but of vengeance and soil. Even today, nothing grows right in that valley. The earth rejects seed, the birds avoid it, and the wind always changes when you say her name. Cold Creek didn't die. It just learned how to wait.